Look at Bafana. We can remember 1996 when we won the CAF Cup. And it'll be a mistake to remind ourselves all the time that, well, 1994, progressive constitution, etc. I think, Chair, we are in a danger of having a middle-class centric approach to the discussions. If we want to really bring the public with us, we must address the fundamental socio-economic challenges workers, society at large faces. We have an unemployment crisis of 45%. We are rated time and again by the World Bank, etc., as the most unequal nation in the world. Life has not changed fundamentally in Khayelitsha since 1994, or in Tabazimbi. It's gotten better in Sandton and Constantia, for sure, there's no problem with that, but we're not bringing our public with. So the public is losing hope. We've seen the voter turnout in each election. It's plummeting all the time. It's not necessarily because they're irritated with the ANC, it's because they have lost a sense of ownership, of buy-in, etc. I think, Chair, also some of the things we need to also kind of be frank about. I think Comrade Mcebisi did touch on it a bit, or Professor Africa, is about a lack of consequence for corruption, for state capture. We see people pontificating on Twitter all the time. They are standing for election in my political party, the ANC, all the time, winning office. Yet they've been implicated in state capture and corruption. There's no consequence. We don't see people being arrested in sufficient numbers. We don't see sufficient assets being attached. We don't see people getting to court, to trial, to prison, etc. And in fact, Chair, you know, in the VBS scandal, we lost 2 Samoa shop stewards in Vembe, assassinated for blowing the whistle. Yet we are seeing people who are implicated in VBS looting, sitting in parliament, being elected to office, no consequence. So it's difficult. We're going to lose popular support for our democracy if people don't see a sense of consequence. I think Professor Africa was right about the issue of whistleblowing. But Chair, I think also there's the issue of individual responsibility. I was with one minister, let me rather say, and she gave all the right rhetoric, renewal, corruption, blah, 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 blah. But what I see this very same minister doing is the opposite of that. So we can make all the slogans, but if we don't take individual responsibility, say, as myself, I'm going to pay my taxes, I'm not going to steal, I'm not going to litter, I'm not going to beat my wife, and all these things, then we're missing the game. And I think our comments fail to see it. But look, let's also not just pick on ministers too, and they must be kicked. As society as well, the police can't be in all of our homes enforcing the rule of law. If society doesn't also abide by it, then we lose the game. Chair, just the last few things. Comrade Mcebisi talked about electoral reform. And sure, there is a need for that. But I think we must also keep it simple. The one benefit of our electoral system is that people have understood it. One vote equals so many votes equals one seat in parliament, etc. It's an inclusive system. So you have about a dozen parties in parliament, from the extreme right to the extreme left. And that is a positive thing. There's a danger that if we go purely to the other extreme of a purely constituency system, you will lose some of the smaller political parties, the FF+, for example, which has it adds to the enrichment, without me defending them. But I think also, Chair, we do have a mixed system already. We have a ward system. I'm sure if we would ask colleagues here, I doubt even 5% can name our ward councillors. I would struggle after Google search it quickly, you know. Some of our worst comrades or worst councillors across political party are ward councillors. Of course, there are good ones too. But Chair, also we must be careful of going the European route of fragmentation of the political system, where they struggle to form stable governments like in Britain or Belgium. I think Belgium at one stage, Chair, had for about a year no government. Chair, this is the last thing, and I'll stop. There is also a danger, and I see Lisa Seftel is here, so we must deal with the AG findings, the issue of corruption, etc., you know? But also there's a danger we saw after the violence in KwaZulu-Natal last year, where the colleagues in the Unemployment Insurance Fund were so scared of the AG findings, they went to the other extreme of suffocating payments to people who needed it most. So we must find the right balance within the rule of law. I think the last thing, Chair, is that there's a huge gap between organizations, political parties across the spectrum, even trade unions, business organizations, churches, and society at large. There's a gap between leadership and who we claim to represent, which we must try to address. But I think very lastly, Chair, is that also we have successes too, which we often fail to communicate. We fail to take ownership of it. If you look at what the SIU communicates at times, you see constant updates around people being arrested. There was a chair of the National Lottery Board whose, I think, palace was attached recently. But we don't communicate those successes because we do need to communicate positive things too, to give a sense of hope to the public at large. But thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. Nangado?
Mandla. Wait, Tungengan. It's a mantra that we take very seriously. We do believe in people's power. Probably the youngest person on this panel. So to start off by celebrating and acknowledging the intergenerational mix in the room, it's good to see young folk here. There's a mandate now to you, comrades, is to go into the commission groups over the next 2 days and state your case. There's a call here to think about task teams, specialized task teams, to talk about our interventions and our plan of action as we leave here. You comrades must lead in those task teams. Representation must be very clear. 2 weeks ago, there was a grand parade. Young people marched to the union buildings. And the country called us, and people in this room called us the future. But what we are is the now. And so we need an opportunity to do that work. There are a couple of things. I'm deeply overwhelmed by the morning's inputs. I feel moved because the language was very progressive. The first thing is because we're young, we work on a politics of hope. And I want us to celebrate the fact that we are here because in 2016 we gathered in the same way. We were in Rema Church, a similar contingent of people. We called ourselves something different. But we must connect those dots. And because we met then, we're able to meet now, and we are stronger. So there are revolutionary moments and gains that have happened in the last couple of years that I think we must tell the story when we think about how we're going to sustain this movement and this campaign over the next couple of years. Whilst doing that, two things that I picked up from the inputs from this morning. The first is that people really do believe in this idea of political reform. And I want to say that when we think about the involvement of young people in political reform, whether it's electoral or otherwise, we must understand that young people feel deeply let down by our Constitution, by the principles and notions of democracy in this country. We don't feel represented by the law, we don't feel safe, we don't feel that we are able to gainfully live in South Africa. And that's a crisis in itself. So even when Prof. Sandy speaks about the possibility of living through an insurrection or whatever it's called, civic unrest is going to continue because young people in this country are idle. And so I want to encourage us all, including the young folk in the room, when we think about reform, whether it is political, democratic, electoral, and we go into these commissions over the next couple of days, we must think about the language and the messaging we use to tell our stories. That's going to be the thing that will help drive the ethos of why we're gathered here today. And the reason I think that's important, which is the last thing, is that this grouping of the broad church, we welcome it, and it won't be homogenous. Unkabisi has spoken about sort of the same conditioning. And we must be okay with that. We're going to sit in contrast, but we're going to build towards collective ideals, and it's urgent. The reason the messaging and the language of how we talk about our struggle is important is because we have to think about how we're going to celebrate those gains. So if the full reports come out from Izondo Commission, for example, and we celebrate 3 men in orange vests or overalls, is that really enough for the reality of Abantwana Basezwide? Is that really enough for learners that still go to schools with plain pit latrines? It isn't. But it doesn't mean that we're not going there. The reform sustained through different actions and activities like this moment will sustain a force and a groundswell that will take us to the kind of ideals we want in a future socialist democracy that involves, includes, and is led by young people. Mandla.
Mandla. Thank you. Then we come to Bishop Mpumlwane from the South African Council of Churches.
It works. Thank you. I want to go back to the consciousness that this is Mandela's month, and I want to quote from him. Our experience had made us acutely aware of the possible dangers of a government that is neither transparent nor accountable. To this end, our Constitution contains several mechanisms to ensure that government will not be part of the problem, but part of the solution. He goes on to say, public awareness and participation in maintaining efficiency in government within the context of human rights are vital to making a reality of democracy. Now, I want to suggest that what we're trying to do here this weekend is beginning to live out what Mandela was talking about here. And if we are going to turn the country away from the backsliding that Cebisi talked about, we need the public awareness and participation. And therefore, a movement for change is now. We say at the South African Council of Churches, we cannot expect accountability from government if we do not take responsibility for what we need government to do to facilitate our self-development. And therefore, this conference must come out with what, Rev Chikane called it a people's manifesto. It really is driving towards a demand-driven political system, not a supply-driven, where we wait for political parties to give us their manifestos. We say, oh, that one is there. We just shop around and say, that's better than the other one. No, we should be demand-driven. Here's what we want. Tell us how you're going to deliver it. When the public reacts to public wrongdoing or assesses the actions or lack thereof on the part of government, they do so on the basis of an innate set of values that speak to what is right and what it will take to achieve and sustain that. These is what we refer to as public values and standards. We need to, therefore, to come away with what makes for the kind of values and standards that we're prepared to live with, where our tax money must go. There are members of the South African Council of Churches here, and they will expect me to say this, that in February last year, the heads of SACC churches made a call, and they said, we stand to warn the governing party that South Africans will not stand for and tolerate destabilization and chaos from any quarter, and certainly not from the ranks of a party charged with the Constitution and with the responsibility for by the Constitution with the responsibility for public order. The trust of South Africans given at elections is sacred, and we need the governing party to reassure South Africa that as a party, they wholeheartedly support and defend the Constitution and its institutions, including the judiciary that has repeatedly been attacked publicly without evidence of wrongdoing adduced. These are the makings of institutional destabilization. We therefore said we yearn to hear from all a loud no to destabilization. Democracy, defend our democracy is the answer. It therefore needs a movement beyond that, this meeting, for public values and standards. But then, of course, the destabilization did not end, because in July we had the unrest that we talked about this morning. Now, at that time, again, we made certain observations which I would like to put on record here today, because we wrote this to the African National Congress. We said the ANC is both the mother and the midwife of the current public disorder. It is the mother because the problem has been brewing progressively within the body of the ANC for some time, with the country watching with bated breath. The ANC is the midwife of the current public disturbance, as it arises from the fact that it is ANC members that threatened, initiated, propelled, and defended public disorder. And that is why you still don't know who gets arrested for it. In this regard, the SSC church leaders conclude that the ANC internal divisions have become the main threat to public order, and that the state that is for the well-being of all is held hostage by party disagreements on options between right and wrong in relation to governmental integrity and the rule of law. That literally, the hostage-taking of the state and its people are routinely confronted with chilling, terroristic voice notes on death-threatening messages. And so, I will not go to the rest of the observations we made, but to say we need here to come away with a clear statement of values and standards of what we're prepared to stand for. I offer some. South Africa is a constitutional democracy where the constitution is the highest law of the land, rooted in openness, democracy, accountability, and social justice. Such a constitutional democracy must be anchored in serving the interests of all who live in this country, especially those who are socially, economically, and politically the weakest. And that therefore means there has to be an accountable relationship between the boss, which is the citizenry, and the government, which is simply a manager of the state employed by the citizens. That is why I support the view that there should be a direct elections of legislators because they are employees of the people. And for this, we need probity and integrity measures for eligibility to public office so that you don't just get people elected because I like them. There must be certain standards that are set and a professionalized as against politicized civil service and local independent structures for elections monitoring and an independent anti-corruption structure as suggested by the Zondo Commission and an institutionalized nationwide whistleblowing management and support and reward system. I'm going to close just now. The second thing is a commitment to the promise of the post-apartheid South Africa. We need to know that there was a promise, and that promise is not written, but it's understood, of a just, reconciled, peaceful, equitable, and sustainable society, free of racism, tribalism, xenophobia, and gender prejudices, free of corruption and deprivation, with food and shelter for all, and every child born to grow to its God-given potential, Ms. Madube-Dube. For this, we need a common nationhood. We share one real estate called South Africa, but we have not become one nation. And unless we become that, we will always have these diverse interests that are pulling at each other. And that actually speaks against the preamble of our Constitution. We need an economic architecture that includes the excluded majority, and an education system that includes investment in the first 9 years of life for the intake that allows readiness for economic and intellectual participation. I think that if we don't do that, we will not be able to succeed in reversing the slide. Thank you.
Manda.
Thanks, Mandla. Just let me perhaps talk directly to some of the inputs that have been made this morning. Frank described what the Defend Our Democracy campaign is all about, and that we will not tolerate anybody destabilizing us and so on. I think that's absolutely correct, and the Defend Our Democracy campaign was formed on that basis. But I think that we also need to then look at what are the hard choices we need to make and what are the hard discussions we need to have. And how does the Defend Our Democracy campaign, which is a broad church, and I think it must be a broad church because I don't know what's left and right anymore, to be quite honest with you. I don't know what's... and so we have in this church organizations that some of us might be uncomfortable with. But there are organizations that, in the current context, are protecting democracy. And it's a very different way of interacting and engaging and beginning to understand each other than a lot of the people in this room had become used to over our many years in struggle and essentially under the banner of the ANC and the democratic movement. So I think one of the things that we need to talk about this weekend is in going forward, how does the Defend Our Democracy campaign play a pivotal role in marshalling this broad church towards critical aspects of protecting and rebuilding our democracy that we would all be comfortable with. And I think that's something we need to discuss. Then just let me go to Mtabisi's talk, which I thought was extremely useful. And a number of people have talked about this. The issue about, sorry, it's old age, issue about the architecture of our political system. Now, the local government elections, the outcome of the local government elections was not just a vote of no confidence on the ANC. Because a lot of people who didn't vote for the ANC did not necessarily vote for another party. They just didn't vote. And I think the message there is that people are telling us, we don't trust any of you. We don't trust the political system. We don't trust the way it is structured, because it does not actually give us a say on how we should hold our leaders accountable, what our leaders should be doing, and so on. And so what does that actually mean? Electoral reforms, absolutely, but electoral reforms towards what? And while we focus, and the debate is to a great extent focused in the discussions that are had amongst people in this room and elsewhere, focused on the problems in the majority party at the moment. I'm not convinced that's where the debate should be focused. We are 2 years away from the national elections. The debate should be focused on what do we do between now and then to ensure that we have a different political architecture. And what sort of political leaders and what sort of political parties we want to promote. And how we're going to mobilize and organize people towards them. And even mobilizing and organizing, it's I think, very different ways of doing it than the ways many of us were used to. So I think that there's some hard discussions to be had on what do we start doing to have a political system and a political architecture backed up by an electoral system that's appropriate for that, that will actually get us the sorts of parties and leaders that through an appropriate electoral system we can hold accountable, we can trust, and who are honest. At this point in time, I don't care where they're sitting. But that's the system we need. And we've got to ask ourselves the hard questions. And for a lot of us, these have been hard questions. Do we now say that part of that new political architecture is not necessarily a majority ANC? And the ANC that a lot of us have grown up through may not necessarily be the party that delivers the sort of leadership and accountability that we need, because they're not demonstrating that at the moment. Now, these are hard discussions. These are tough discussions. But I think we need to have that this weekend. I think the other thing is we need to ask we have a number of crises in this country. One of the discussions we've been having in business is that do we have a political crisis in this country or an economic crisis in this country? Because business should be held to account to do business properly. How does what has become essentially, for want of a better term, an illegitimate government hold business to account? And so we're beginning to think about whether we should, the normal response of business is business doesn't get involved in politics. Well, my view is that politics is getting involved in business. And maybe Songeza will comment on that. And it's absolutely in the interest of business to be a critical participant in the discussion starting and toward the next 2 years on what sort of political architecture we put into place. Because if we don't get that right, you're not doing business in this country in 20 years' time. So I think these are all hard questions, and I think we should be talking about it now. The one other issue, before I just quickly to Sandy's input, Mandla, is that, and this is a personal thing for me, everything we've been talking about has also led to is that to a certain extent, well, we've certainly lost our moral compass as a society, not just business or government or labor or anybody else, as a society. And to a certain extent, some of the results of the lack of governance, violence on children, violence on women, what happened at the East London Tavern, for instance. Every week we hear 6, 7 people being shot, whether it's in Khayelitsha or wherever else. And we just shrug and carry on. We've, to a certain extent, become dehumanized. And that's been the impact of everything that's been happening, and we need to deal with that as part of this process. So let me stop there on that. And just a couple of points on Sandy's input. I think, you know, the input we gave to Sandy's commission from business, to us was absolutely clear that this was an organized insurrection. The experience of many businesses was that the people who initially walked into warehouses and so on knew exactly how complicated and complex fire alarm systems work, knew exactly how to block access, knew exactly at what levels fire systems will kick in. And they destroyed all of that and CCTVs and so on before they started burning. So these were people who knew these things. And certainly from a business point of view, the intention was to cripple the economy and to cripple the entire supply chain. Now this is organized destruction. One, for political purposes, but two, because if you don't destroy, and if systems start working, you go to jail for what you've done. And they're protecting that, and they're avoiding that. So I think we just need to, and Sandy talked about a number of issues that need to be addressed. I think the one thing that I think hasn't been mentioned is that we have organized structures of people and organizations that are deliberately bringing down this country across a whole range of areas. And I don't think our intelligence services are anywhere close to those. And either because they don't have the capacity or because they themselves have been infiltrated to the extent that they won't do it. So I think that we just need to begin to recognize the nature and the extent of the crisis this country is in. Because if we don't do that, we're not going to be able to talk about that this weekend. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. And thank you, Comrade Mandla, for the message of support and solidarity, which is enormously appreciated. I want to say that the last few weeks, seeing the response to us having taken up this matter relating to Zimbabwe exemption permits has been illuminating. And make no mistake, we occupy a relatively privileged position, and it is not as if we are immediately in harm's way, but it has been illuminating in giving some sense of what it must be to be a migrant in this country right now, and the physical danger and insecurity that is faced. And I don't want to talk too much about the case. It is one which people might disagree on, and that is absolutely their rights. And I would also say that given the extent of of poverty and unemployment that plagues this country and that devastates so many lives, it must seem for some, understandably, that it is a bit rich that resources are being expended in order to try and vindicate the rights of foreign nationals in South Africa. I would only say that it is important to keep in mind the words of the Constitutional Court in one of our first and most famous cases, which is that of State versus Makwanyane. And those words were that only if we are prepared to protect the rights of the worst and the weakest amongst us can we all be secure that our own rights will be protected. And it is in that spirit that, that we undertake and bring this action. And I think what the two keynote speakers referred to is the politics of scarcity that we seem to be creating, this narrative of scarcity, that the promises of the Constitution essentially can't be made available to all of us, that that only some of us should be rewarded with its promise, and that really is informing so much of our political discourse now. So that instead of looking to a kind of rich, ambitious, inclusive narrative, we keep looking to others for their potential to be scapegoats. So it's the Constitution that's holding us back. It's the courts that are holding us back. It's foreigners. It's the NGOs. And I think that type of language, that type of narrative is so impoverishing of the political landscape. And I think it stands in such stark contrast to where we were 12 or so years ago. And it's not, by no means am I suggesting that we were in a place that represented the attainment of the Constitution's promise. We were very far from it. But again, I mean, to refer to the two keynote speakers, and I think what they vividly are able to evoke is the sense of psychological damage that we as South Africans have experienced, having seen the effects of state capture, of the kind of the violence that has gone along with that. And I think it is very easy to get lost in that psychological trauma, to feel despondent, to feel hopeless, and to be sort of undone by pessimism. But I think it is really important to remember that as great as the damage and the destruction that has been brought about as a result of a systematic state capture, it's important to bear in mind where we were. And I think, I mean, for those of us, and everyone in the room will be familiar with the basic outlines of state capture, and it's hard to know what represents the most flagrant episode or experience of that. But I am always struck by what happened within the South African Revenue Services, right? That institution was held up before state capture took place as a model of revenue collection. And it wasn't just a model in the developed world, right? What we had to do here was harder than what revenue collection entities have to do in the developed world. SARS was the avenue by which, the path by which we would meet the promises of the Constitution. It was how we would pay for the socioeconomic promises in the Constitution. And as I said, it was held up as a global model of revenue collection, and it was systematically destroyed. But the persons who staffed SARS, who made it that model of, that global model, continue to be around. They are a model of public service, of public servants that we can still have access to. And so, you know, I bring this up because against the examples and all the reasons that we have to feel demotivated. I think one also has to remember where we came from, what we were in the process of doing, and that as difficult as it may be to get back there, we have the skills and we have the potential to do so. And that is worth clinging on to, and I think is reason to give us hope. Thanks very much.
Mind that. So, Songoza, you've got the last 7 minutes.
I'll take 5.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll focus my response. I'll include the Reverend Chikane's points in my response because I think they were very, very important as well. But I'll start with my reflections on the last 27 years of democracy and the relationship with state capture and what that has given us as a good part of the symptom, not necessarily the bad, but we need to look at it. My view is that we saw how we have not built a culture of continuous democratic participation in order to ensure that there is continuous and meaningful democratic accountability from elected representatives and from state institutions which may just be agencies and not elected bodies. The nature of our architecture is such that in order to make this system work, we have needed to professionalize the process of extracting public accountability by having actual organizations, NGOs, that are particularly going to litigate in order to extract the accountability from parliament, from government in particular. It's also therefore pitted the judiciary against elected bodies in a way that has become unhelpful. In an open democracy such as ours, what we have to do is we have to find ways of giving power back to the people. But that power comes with responsibilities. And that responsibility is a population that is sufficiently informed about the democracy itself, its institutions, and ways in which it can participate. A system that enables participation rather than makes it a hindrance, such as now. And I'll come back to some of what we can do maybe as one of the possible resolutions out of this meeting. So we need to think about the project of democratization. And I've come to realize for myself as an individual that voting diligently in every election, as I have done, except the one time when I moved from one city to the other and it was a local government election, is not enough. So that is the first point I want to make. That relates to what the Reverend said earlier on, which is that So which relates to what Reverend Chikane said earlier on about the fact that we must not allow the confusion that is possible now in terms of who this democracy belongs to, who should be accountable to the people, and I think ultimately who should have the manifesto with which to hold those who are in power accountable. So I think that democratization project as a whole is important. And I think we do need to think about a democratic education and accountability campaign, especially for young people. Because what has happened is that because we have this system that does not lend itself to easy participation, is we are beginning to see millions upon millions of people believing that this democracy does not work. And we can't have our democratic institutions being seen as inherently illegitimate, or that in order for people to make them accountable, therefore, they have got to, you've got to have a body to which you belong, you must have resources, you need donor funding, and so on. We can't make it that difficult for ordinary people to participate democratically between elections. So that is a first point I want to make. second last point, and if the elected are democratically elected in a reformed electoral system, you can trust them a bit more with that power. So how does this relate to what the Prof said? I think what we have seen is a state that is no longer capable of doing the basic task of keeping the polity, the state itself, the whole democratic edifice safe and secure. It is no longer able to keep the population safe because it does not have the inherent capability to synthesize and analyze and make sense of the information, in particular outside of the party political and factional thinking that has permeated state institutions. I have friends at ESCOM, I have friends in the security services. Some of them think in a factional way when they are in those positions of responsibility. And so there is no sense of national purpose. And so I will go back again to what I said earlier in closing, which is the project of democratic education and accountability and the sense of national purpose is really important because the generation before us had a sense of national purpose because of the struggle for freedom. What has happened now is that we have an abstract set of objectives that we're aspiring for, and that is giving the opportunity to anti-democratic forces to use populism and the strains that the population and people are feeling in order to take further advantage of them, to advance anti-democratic tendencies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me thank our panelists for the insights they've brought into these deliberations today. I walk away just now with the idea that there is hope, and we all agree that there is a way forward, that there is a need for what Mcebisi Jonas calls a game plan for the struggles that are going to continue, and that we have to recognize what he calls the new political moment. Noncedo calls it new revolutionary moment. And she goes on to speak about the idea of the new language by which we tell our stories and the messagings, therefore. And Bishop Mpumlwane, particularly the issue of public awareness is very important. The idea of what he calls demand-driven manifesto, bottom-up. The whole issue of the movement. I think at the end of tomorrow, we'll have a clear idea as to what that constitutes. The idea of new politics, as it is here. An important point, I think we should arrive at that, Bishop Mpumlwane, the issue of a statement of values that actually should be enshrined in our declaration as we go. Public accountability, it's very important. And the project of democratic engagement, as Song as well is talking about, it's very important. So I think we've got the basic outlines and frame for the discussion going forward. Thank you very much for your insight. And now we're going to have Mr. Chikane to give us a feedback on public submissions that have been made for the conference paper. This is not the Reverend at all. Where is the Chikane? Oh, he's here. He's here. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay. I assume you are a program director. Where is where? Yeah, don't forget your role. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much.
I don't have to introduce Rekhotso Fetsi. The only thing that, yeah, because we've already done, the only thing I'll say is that he's a fallist, so you must watch him. But you've got, you had 15 minutes, now it's 10. And I know you'll do it. Okay.
So, I don't know if my slides are up.
Who's controlling them?
Okay, perfect. So I can't actually see the slides behind me, so we're going to be working on faith here. So my name is Rev Chikane. I was given a very simple task, which was how do you collate the various different views submitted by the general public to this conference in response to the conference paper that was publicized. These comments ranged from different provinces, different individuals, but the major purpose of this was to get the general public's opinions around what this movement is trying to do, right? And to elicit a form of debate. And I use the word here called ferocity, because I wasn't sure how to capture the energy of the comments that came in, right? You could see that each respondent must have spent at least 40 minutes to an hour of their life answering 32 questions posed by the Defend Our Democracy movement, right? So it's quite important to take these views quite seriously because they also pose interesting questions that differ with some of the speakers before, and some of them agree with some of the speakers before. And the responsibility of us in this room is how do we collate those ideas. So I'll skip over this, but the general areas of the focus of the document was understanding people's conceptions of what a constitutional democracy looks like, the weakening of or the threats to our constitutional democracy, the need to defend our democracy, and what should be done to protect our constitution. There was about 97 responses, with only about 66 giving their actual location. And I think it's important to note that the responses came from two predominant provinces. And in fact, one province didn't give any responses. So it speaks volumes about what is the reach of Defend Our Democracy. Who are we talking to? How are we talking to them? How are we getting access to their views and inputs in particular? Are we just doing it online, or are we going into the communities? And I think it bears mention just to show these numbers, but you can see them for yourself. So like I said, there were 32 questions, but the submissions generally focused around 12 themes, with reform in particular being quite a large theme, so I had to break that down into 7 different groupings, which I'll talk about just now. Right, so these are the general themes, but I'll talk to them one by one. Look at me pressing buttons and not actually changing the slides. But these were the general themes, right? And I'm going to break them down one by one as we go along. So the first one spoke to access to justice, right? And it was a general belief that the justice system of the country didn't need deep reform. In fact, the justice system of the country was keeping us together. The major problem that citizens had was access to justice, the administrative processes of accessing the justice system. So there's a huge level of respect for the institution as a whole, but deep questions and proposals made about how do you improve the administrative access of citizens to this system. The most dominant of all the themes was accountability across the board. There was very few respondents who didn't in one way or another talk about the importance of accountability of both public servants and politicians. Right? It wasn't immune to just say, how do we hold our politicians accountable? But it was specifically focused on how do you hold individuals who work for the state accountable as well. And these views did not situate themselves with just national issues. A lot of the comments talked about what was happening in their own communities, how local ward councillors, how local public servants just weren't doing their job, but also the idea that there is no existing or no energy invested into rethinking what accountability mechanisms look like within the country. The next one was constitutionalism, and the views here ranged. There were some views, or generally positive views, around the nature of the Constitution, but it is worth noting that there were a few comments that really talked about the negative aspects of the Constitution and what constitutionalism means, right? And it was interesting to read those because they weren't made out of malice or out of fear, but out of a critical engagement about what is the purpose of the Constitution. But regardless of that, there was a lot of suggestions that said we need constitutional amendments, but a lot of the comments made a confusion around what a constitutional amendment means and what changing a piece of legislation means, and how those two are seen as one and the same thing. And it speaks to another theme that pops up just now. Crime was also a dominant theme, and when I say crime, it's both the violent aspects of crime as well as corruption, to kind of put them all in one. I included vandalism. It did pop up in the information and the data, but the problem is that one of the questions just asked point blank, what are your thoughts around vandalism? So it kind of skewed the data to an extent, but crime itself was a major concern for the majority of respondents as well. And the perception around corruption within the state by both public servants and politicians. This theme kept coming up, that it's not just the politicians at fault, it's those who work within the state as well who are at fault for this. And an interesting view that kept coming up is how criminality was linked to the belief that there's a deterioration of South Africa's democratic structures. That criminality wasn't just coming out of nothing. That criminality just wasn't just the result of poverty, but as a consequence of our democracy falling apart. And it was interesting to kind of see those comments and how they interlinked with other issues. There were comments pertaining to the economy, some interesting and very interesting suggestions about what we do with the economy. But one of the most dominant themes when it came to talking about the economy was the acknowledgement that there needs to be some sort of macroeconomic change in the country, right? And I didn't keep all the suggestions because they varied across all 90 respondents. But the dominant theme that did keep coming up was, yes, we can include the private sector a bit more. Yes, we can re-look at tax reform. Yes, we can rethink how the state is engaging in economic development, but regardless of what form of development you approach or you take, it has to be focused on being both inclusive and democratized, that everyone should have access to the economic growth in the country. And all the suggestions kept coming back to that in one way or another, and I think it's quite important that even though one would want macroeconomic change in the country and a restructuring of the economy, it can't be done if it is not inclusive. It was a dominant phrase that kept being tossed in over and over again. Education was interesting, and it got split up into two, at least based on my analysis, is that everyone wants education to be better. It's almost a unanimous view. I assume that most of them were only talking about basic education, but education was seen as important to accountability when you're just looking at a pure word count, sentiment analysis, etc., that education was one of the primary issues that people had, and their concerns around education ranged from the quality of infrastructure, quality of teachers, the dissemination of information, and the Department of Basic Education itself, and whether it is actually fulfilling its constitutional obligations. The other one that was quite interesting was a huge focus on civic education, right? That citizens need to know what it means to be a citizen of the country, what your responsibilities are, what access you have to mechanisms of holding the state accountable, right? It's, as one of the speakers was talking about, what individuals can do. But if you're not educating individuals around what opportunities they have to hold the state accountable, right, to then blame them afterwards becomes a bit of a chicken and egg situation, right? So a huge drive was this idea of civic education as well. An interesting one that I think the conference should debate is there were very mixed views around the perspectives of immigrants in the country. And these views ranged from, and I'll be blunt because I don't like lying, kick them out. Just kick them out. And then there were views that pertain to don't vilify immigrants for the ills of the country. Now, it's a stark reality that citizens will want to view some sort of other as someone that you can blame for problems in society. But these views still exist. And to ignore them becomes a bit of a dangerous game. And I think those uncomfortable conversations need to be had about how do you reconcile these views. It is also important to note that most people had an issue with illegal immigrants, right? So not just anyone who was in the country, but that question of what illegality means and how you define that for a citizen is something that this conference needs to contend with as well. And I think it's quite important, and I'll leave it for the plenaries to discuss it further. I won't talk about leadership too much. Sorry, I missed that slide. But I won't talk about leadership too much, simply because there was no clear definition of what leadership means. All the definitions, all the different approaches varied in their application, and I think there's a need for the conference to understand what it means for public servants and politicians to have good leadership qualities, and what type of leadership we're looking for. It's very easy to be better at leading, be a quality leader, but what does that actually mean? And then the aspect of how do citizens also become leaders themselves was something that became quite prominent in one way or another. The second last issue was around morals and ethics. There was a genuine belief from a lot of the comments that politicians, right, so we can now separate the civil service and politicians, that politicians don't know the difference between right and wrong, which is fascinating, right, that every time it kept coming up, that there's a genuine belief that politicians do not have a moral compass. Not as a critique, but as a this doesn't make any sense, that they don't understand the difference between right and wrong. When it came to civil servants, a lot of the questions was around ethics, and that question pertained to, do civil servants have a code of ethics? Right? There were different words used for what a code of ethics would look like, but it was, how do you instill a code of ethics for civil servants as well? These morals and ethics became an interesting question that I think needs a lot more unpacking, but in a very simple way it is, there's almost a moral and ethical deficit within the state. And how do we as those in the room think about how do you renew that as well? The reforms, like I said, span 7 different areas. There were suggestions around how you reform civil servants, the civil service, the Constitution, electoral reform, political parties, the presidency itself, parliament, and generally how you improve representation of citizens in the country. Right? These reforms were vast. I didn't put them in these slides, but they were vast, there were many. A lot of them, in a very simple way of understanding it, said that the presidency and parliament are not doing their job, therefore they need to be changed. Right? If you remember, the first comment that I made is that citizens generally believe that access to justice and the justice system as a whole was holding us together, which means the 2 other spheres of government were failing in the eyes of the respondents. And 2 out of 3 structures of government are failing, then it bears a lot of questions about how do we go about fixing that. The last thing, because Chair, I think I've gone over my 10, haven't I? is, and I left it as last, not just because it was you, but everyone wanted unity. It was a dominant theme, that everyone generally believed that you can't do this if you're divided, that there was a general call to improve unity across the country. This was all respondents across provinces. I couldn't find a province that might have differed or a particular gender that might have differed, nothing. Everyone unilaterally believed that everyone has to be unified. And the last thing I'll say is, because I can't give my 2 cents opinions, is it wasn't a theme that came up, but a lot of the respondents put a challenge to the conference, and I think we need to take it quite seriously, which is we want clear, identifiable next steps. That people didn't want rhetoric and wishy-washy statements and commitments for the country to become better, but people wanted clear, identifiable next steps that they could participate in. And I think that's something worth mentioning. Thank you.
Well done. That's yours. Well done, very well done, Khosofetsi. Thank you very much for summarizing what was a very lengthy process of responding to the conference paper. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm aware that we have run completely out of time. What we are going to do, I'm going to leave you at this stage and hand you over to Shan, who will he will come and explain what's going to happen next and then take us to lunch. He will also announce lunch. Let me take this opportunity to thank the presenters during my session. I take quite a lot from this morning's session. The problems are deep in the country, but we are up to the task. That's what I take away from today. I take away the warning from Dr. Jonas that the suggested social compacts don't go deep enough. I take the warning from Kes that we need to focus over the next 2 years on the kind of country that we want. The leaders will emerge out of a process. The more important one is what kind of country do we want to build going forward, and stop this focus on, throwing names around like Mcebisi says, like a coach for Bafana Bafana. I take away, from the summary, the question of accountability that Rev said is one of the most commented on. I take away the question of unity that he says every response refers to. We look forward to those suggested reforms. I think it's important for us as we go into commissions this afternoon and tomorrow for us to look at the specifics around those reforms so that we can see. I am certain that there are some that we can incorporate into our resolutions, so declaration or line of march or whatever we are told to do. I'm ready, Muruti. Me, I'm just a soldier. So whatever we are told to do tomorrow, I know Cheryl is going to close the conference tomorrow, so I'll be waiting to hear. But from my side, Shan, where are you? Where? Oh, I didn't see you. From my side, thank you so much. You've been great comrades, and we'll be back here. And we are going to get this country right, believe me. We are going to get it right. Thank you.
So, good afternoon, everybody. Can we get the lights now? Because this session is really about you doing some work at the tables that you're seated at. So we need the full set of lights on. But while we're waiting for that, I think indicative of the times that we live in is just this little story. So there's this youngster riding his bicycle on the street where Parliament is, decides to park it there, and then walks away, and then there's these policemen that guard Parliament, and they come to him and they says, "Man, do you know what this place is? Do you know who comes here? There are ministers, there are presidents, there are heads of states, there are members of Parliament, and all of these people are going to come here." He says, "Sir, do you think I need to get another lock and chain to keep my bicycle safe?" And that's really the time that we are in. Now, originally there were 2 hours set aside for what you need to do in the next 35 minutes. At your table, you will see a very big kind of sheet. What that sheet was meant to do was, as the various speakers were talking, we were really wanting you to note down what you thought were the threats to this democracy. What are the areas of renewal that different speakers have spoken about? What are the areas of change to this democracy that many of them have spoken about? And then to have concluded, what are the sets of actions to take either of those areas of work forward? So, at every table, what we do want you to do is to spend the next 10 minutes. Firstly, introduce yourselves, if you haven't done that, but share with each other at the table what democracy work you are actually involved in. So in what ways do you defend or advance democracy to get your conversations going? And where there are 2 or 3 people, move to other tables so that you have a full complement of people at the table. What I do want for each table to do is to quickly go through what you think is the big threat. What's the one key area of renewal? What's the one key area of change? Then 2 specific recommendations around actions that you want to propose to this conference on either areas of renewal and change. Just keep it at 2. We will try to then just take some input from all of you, but we will also collect all of these big sheets. And if we finish this, you then get lunch. If we don't, we cancel lunch. But I also want to thank all of you for this 48 hours of commitment to democracy work today and tomorrow. And my plea to all of you is don't disappear today, at the end of today, because you need to help tomorrow to shape the program of work that you want this conference to take forward. So that's really what I want from you. 10 minutes, please do what, get us to your specific areas of action, and then we'll get feedback from as many tables as possible before we break for lunch. Are we clear? All right, thank you. You have about 5 minutes to zone into specific action recommendations. Yes, Akira. I haven't seen him yet. Which one is this on jobs? Sure. Trying to check the room. Not offhand. Not offhand. But Pali had confirmed. Get Coogan to track him. Coogan will probably have other numbers for him. Okay. I'm really sorry to intrude on these wonderful conversations that many of you seem to be having. Some of them way off the areas that you should have been talking about, but given that we've not met in this space for about 3 years now, I can understand the need to talk about everything under the sun. What we really want, you're going to leave those sheets there, but I want you to talk about just your specific actions that you think, having listened to all that has been said this morning, having identified the threats, having looked at areas where our democracy needs to be renewed and where it needs to be changed, what's the action? And each table or each contribution, you've got a minute to speak to the one action that you think we must now take into account. And please, if it has been covered by somebody else, then there's no need to repeat it, even if you're going to use different kinds of language to say the same thing. Right. Can I check? Are we ready to go? On my left? No, you have to be ready now. Otherwise, you're not getting lunch. Right. I need a runner with a mic. There's a hand up there. Can we start at that table? Right, 1 minute. I thought I saw your hand up there, Nick. No? Okay. Nobody's ready yet to give us their thoughts. You are an ungovernable crowd. Can we get somebody to kick us off with your recommendation? All right, here's a table here. Zelda, your table. Right, can you decide who's giving us the 1 minute input? 1 minute, 60 seconds.
Testing. Oh, okay. So, under key actions for civil society, under key actions for civil society, what we have is we've got protection of whistleblowers.
Can you just hold the mic a bit closer to the mouth?
Oh, okay.
Speak into it.
Is it clearer now?
Yeah.
Okay. So we've got protection of whistleblowers. We've got
Give us one action. One action, please.
Oh, one action. Yeah, protection of whistleblowers would be our one action then.
Okay.
Because we've got 3.
What specifically around protection of whistleblowers must be
So
done?
in communities where people are actually, what can I say, they call it snitching on everyone who's doing all of the illegal activities and the corruption in the community. So we need to find a forum that's actually going to safeguard the people who are coming out with the truth, because most of them get assassinated, they get killed and so forth. You know, just to keep them
community
off.
protection for whistleblowers, if I understand you.
That's
Okay,
that's
lovely.
Yes.
That's
Sure.
a very clear recommendation. Let's take that. Right, next table.
Next table, okay, thank you.
Can we get on to the next table? Faisal Randera, your table should lead by example. Can we get to the next table there? Right, thank you.
Thank you very much. One point that we have agreed upon, create safe space for education, knowledge production, voter education, public awareness, how to manage conflicts.
Just explain to us what you mean by a safe space.
Safe space meaning that we are creating, as the DO, creating space where we can now deliver what we are saying in terms of education.
Okay. Right, again, community spaces where these conversations can happen in a safe environment and where people can talk freely across party lines and across ideological lines. Okay, thank you.
We've got 2 suggestions.
Give us one.
No, well, they're interlinked. The one is to rebuild an independent civic movement, which has now fragmented. Without a strong civic movement, we cannot hold government or the bureaucracy to account. The second thing is to have independent trade unions without coalitions with political parties. In other words, genuine independent working class organization.
Good, thank you very much.
The next point, is connected to NEDLAC.
No, thank you very
NEDLAC
much.
at the moment
You've given
is
us your
supposed
2.
to...
Thank
okay,
you.
so
Thank
just
you.
flag NEDLAC, please,
Thank
to
you.
expand
Thank
it.
you. We've got your
Thank
2
you.
points. Thank you very much. Right, from 2. Yeah, welcome. One proposal.
One
table,
proposal.
Yep.
My name is Samuel Johnson, and we are suggesting that the education system should be changed entirely. The education system is colonized, and it should be changed because we are taught in a way that makes us unemployable. There's a lot of issues that are pertaining to education. So we feel that if that is tackled, basic education, we fought for free tertiary education, we are speaking about the change in basic education, right from the ground.
Okay,
to
changing
up.
basic education, decolonizing it. Thank you. All right.
Thank you very much. We want to acknowledge the youngest participant there, Arusha.
Let's leave the acknowledgements. Let's get to the action.
The sectoral engagement is it's a proposal we want to make with a particular focus on artistic and linguistic communities.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.
Right, let's come. Mr. Mike, roving Mike. Okay.
Hi, key for us is civic and political grassroots education, advocacy, and knowing and understanding your rights. We also believe there needs to be advocacy for changes in legislation of the Constitution as well as the electoral system.
Good, thank you.
I'm here.
Okay, Faisal, that mic has a life of its own.
I am.
Thank you. While we support other points,
Hello.
we are saying that we must abolish. We
But
must
he's got the
abolish
mic.
the
Let him carry
current
on.
provincial system since it breeds ethnicity and tribalism.
Just repeat, I'm not too sure.
We must abolish the current provincial system. It's costly.
Okay,
It
get rid of
breeds
provinces.
ethnicity and tribalism, so to speak.
Good, thank you.
And
Right.
I'm here. From our table, we're talking 2 points, working towards a strong electoral reform and community participation and security.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Hi, can I go?
Yep.
A lot of it has been covered. One of the things that stands out is civil society oversight, especially over local government, and also building a network of citizen science activists around environment and climate change.
Right, good.
Good afternoon. From the Gen Z table, our solutions are building a culture of participation through civil education, as well as eradicating restriction and gatekeeping, of participation through accountability of politicians and civil servants. Thank you.
Good, and you've written that down then on your sheets because we're going to collect them to take all these wonderful ideas forward. Right?
Okay. From our table, we have basically spoken about all the things that has been mentioned already. One of the things that we see as a challenge is the fake news or the disinformation in our communities and in our country, and we're wondering how can we work out a mechanism to counter this fake news or disinformation, maybe encourage robust freedom of expression. That's the one thing. And the second thing is also to bring communities together. All of us that are here are connected in our communities with other groups. If we get there, bring these conversations from here to those communities and grow the group bigger.
Lovely. Disinformation and further grassroots work. Right?
Thank you. It's Chamongwe Harry Masindi from Make It Happen Foundation. The first one is the revision of the procurement bill. The second one is the public awareness and public participation in regard to the democratic participation.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Hi, our group suggests that there be constitutional literacy at grassroots level, stabilization of security apparatus, and holding of parliamentarians accountable, and holding political actors accountable.
Good, thank you.
Okay. Ours is a political campaign to change the electoral system as a key issue for the 2024 election.
Wonderful, thanks. Right? tables that haven't yet spoken? Can the mic also move to the right at some point? Okay, if you've got it, speak.
Chair, we here, ready to report?
Thank you.
Okay. So what we have come up with, Chair, as a unified approach is that if we can look at the structural adjustment programs and impact policy, it will have a trickle-down effect to all the rest of the departments for implementation and a democratic, unified implementation of policy where it matters most. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Please write that up there.
Okay, hi. So as has been a common theme, what we were really focusing on in terms of actions was civic and democratic education for mobilizing grassroots movements. And one of these, a sort of concrete, actionable thing that we could do is look at access committees where people can go to these committees and find out their rights and access to education. And we also mentioned decolonizing education would be very important.
Thank you. Okay, can we move to the last few tables that haven't spoken yet?
Yes, thanks, Chair. Musue Sokonyela from Harambee. Our group focused on having more effective social compacting approaches to all these threats that face our democracy, having government, civil society, and the private sector come together in solving these solutions, not in silos, because that's not working.
Good, thank you. Let's get your table.
Thank you very much. So from ours, our key action was the involvement of young people or civil society in the institutions in the Chapter 9 of the Constitution that safeguard our democracy. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you. Right.
So, to promote youth unemployment and development, we need a professional, depoliticized public administration with a party being a reformed police reform focusing on human rights.
Good.
Our table would like better policies for business tenders and improved procurement policies in our country. Thank you.
I was hoping, I didn't mishear you to say our table wants tenders. Okay. All right. Okay. No, I've heard you. Thanks.
You so much.
The policy, get the better policies around tenders. All right. Yes. Can we get the mic here, please? Okay.
Our groups said that strengthening civil society, political education and participation, building broader civic and institutional support for honest and accountable public servants.
Lovely. Concise. All right.
In our group, we spoke of a threat, which is intergenerational gap that we have. So we said the solution would be that the very same forum that we have in this session should be in the communities where people are now conscious to say that young people need to be on the forefront in terms of when it comes to democracy to bring solutions that they're supposed to implement.
Lovely. Okay. Can we finish any outstanding table now?
On our group, we said we need to elect the cabinet on merit and professionalism through public interviews and not as opposed to political appointments.
Good.
In our group, we agreed that the threat that we are having is a constitution, the enforcement of the constitution not being followed. So the key action for civil society, we agreed on saying civil society organizations should to be represented in every legislation of the government, starting from local, regional, provincial, and nationals.
Lovely. Is there any table that
Yes,
hasn't spoken?
we agreed on giving people platform to participate in democracy, and emphasized more on civic education, to get the voice from the ground. Thank you.
Okay. I think we are done. So if that table can just give us a hearing. Thank you. One is a request for you to make sure that all of these ideas are on the sheet. If you have to use the back of it, that's also fine. Two, I just want to talk to you about the breakaway commissions that happens after lunch. You would have all have received some color dot on your registration. There are 7 breakaway sessions. The first breakaway session on making democracy work better will be in the green room. Making the public service work is in the pink or peach room. Political parties, public representatives and parliament, that's in the white room. Building people's power in a democracy is in the yellow room. Jobs is in the blue room. That's the discussion on jobs. State capture and corruption is in the orange room. Local government is in the red room. You are please requested to go to the rooms that you have been assigned. You have more than enough time. I think you have about 3 hours after lunch to really engage in those discussions. And what we are hoping that you will come out of those discussions as very specific recommendations that you think civil society must be taking forward in each one of them, whether there are policy issues, whether there are policy changes, whether there are issues to be advocated for, whether there are campaigns. What we want is a generation of ideas. We want to avoid this conference ending up with just a declaration. We are hoping to generate ideas through those commissions in very much the same way as this session here has helped us to do. And that brings us to lunch. And will you get lunch? Yes, Ned, you will get lunch. Lunch is from 1 to 2. If I can just get guidance, Keshni, where exactly is lunch? So as you go out of here, on your left-hand side, somewhere along there is lunch. There are people who will guide you to where the lunch needs to be. My last appeal, please stay with us. This is 48 hours for democracy that we're asking you for. There is also a wonderful gala dinner tonight with music and culture and poetry and hopefully some dancing for those of you who want to do it. Please stay for that session as well. Thank you very much. Hey, how's it?
It's just that